trends come and go, making a sudden resurgence long after they faded from the spotlight. Take, for instance, the wide-leg pants that were all the rage in the 1980s, feed by the 90s. They seemed outdated, yet 2 decades later, they made a stylish comeback. The plaid coats popular in the 1960s looked like something your mother would wear by the 1980s, but fast forward another 20 years, and they're the epitome of fashionable retro. This cyclical pattern of trends is not just a phenomenon in the world of fashion, but also in academia, particularly with the concept of theos, state. The concept of the state has undergone its own spiral journey. In 1968, Samuel Huntington's groundbreaking book, Faux Political Order in Changing Societies, shook the academic world. Its central thesis was bold and clear. The most significant political difference between nations lies not in the form of government, but in the depth of governance. The gap between democracies and autocracies is narrow compared to the chasm between states with organizational capacity and effectiveness, and those that lack these qualities. Communist states and Western liberal states are both part of the effective rather than the weak political system. This perspective was revolutionary because it grouped the Soviet Union and the United States into the same category of seeing strong states. Core during the Cold War, these two superpowers were seen as polar opposites. Yet Huntington argued that if we measure states by their governance capabilities rather than their form of government, the U.S. and the USSR were akin to these strong states. While their common adversaries were developing countries mired in turmoil, coups, and revolutions. Marine weak states daily. Huntington's ideas sparked a trend. Scholars began to emphasize the state's role in research. One manifestation was the developmental stage theory proposed by scholars studying the East Asian miracle. This theory posits that East Asian countries were the first to escape poverty among developing nations due to their strong and proactive bureaucratic systems. In these nations, the government, the visible hand, daily crafted industrial policies, coordinated resources like finance, land, taxation, technology, and labor, and steered them towards international markets to boost specific industry. This, in turn, propelled overall economic growth. This was just one example of the rise of the Czech state perspective. Core researchers studying Africa, revolutions, and European history also began to stress the importance of the state. A 1985 anthology titled Acts, Bringing the State Back in, daily marked this trend. However, the state's time in the limelight was short-lived. The dramatic changes in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe shifted the focus of comparative politics. If the Soviet Union was so powerful and essentially the same as the United States, why did it collapse so swiftly? It turned out that the U.S. and the USSR were not the same. After all, the form of governance mattered greatly. Thus, from the 1990s to the early 2000s, the state perspective faded into the background, replaced by the institutionalism. Media during my university years in the 90s, everyone was reading North Coast and Hayek Friedman. Their works largely argued that institutional choices, whole economic and political systems, were the main forces determining a nation's development potential, while the state was the tiger daily that should be the tooth cage date. But as the saying goes, 30 years east of the river, 30 years west, because after a brief lull, the state perspective has made a comeback in the last decade or so. Why? The international political landscape has shifted. Again, if the collapse of the Soviet Union defined the 1990s and early 2000s, shaping the new focus of political science, then China's rise and the setbacks of the third wave of democratization have been the defining changes since around 2008. If institutionalism were correct, why has China, which has not adopted Western-style institutions, been able to rise, while many countries that have are mired in difficulties? Institutions are important, but there must be significant, if not more significant, residual variables. What are these daily residual variables? Thus, the focus has returned to the state. The shift in research is best exemplified by Huntington student Francis Fukuyama. Once hailed as the standard-bearer of Western liberal democracy for his book The End of History, and the last man Fumofo Fukuyama's 2010 book The Origins of Political Order, Daly reads like it was written by a different person. Although his change in views may be overstated, his shift in research focus is undeniable. In a 2015 article titled, "Daily, Why is Democracy Performing So Poorly?" Daily Fukuyama wrote, "Daily, why has the performance of democracy been so disappointing worldwide? In my view, a core factor is in many emerging and existing democracies, state capacity has not kept pace with the demand for democracy. The failure to build modern, well-governed states has been the Achilles heel of recent democratic transition." It seems that after a full circle, Fukuyama has returned to the fold of his mentor, Huntington. So it's clear that there are no pure political science issues. What political science studies is itself a political science question. Every significant shift in political trends brings about a significant change in the framework of political science research. Of course, it's also because political trends are always changing that we cannot easily sentence any research perspective because what was outdated yesterday may return today, and what is outdated today may return tomorrow. This day revolving door phenomenon is less a testament to the frivolity of academic research than to its resilience. The complexity and variability of political life mean that political science research should be just as complex and variable. Why is state capacity so crucial? Now that the state has been brought back into focus, how does it help us understand the world today? State capacity is important, but where does this importance lie? Scholars have provided extensive explanations with the main research concentrated in 3 areas. First and foremost is the importance of the state daily in building order. We've discussed that the essence of the state is the monopolization of violence. Therefore, a strong state is one that has achieved a high degree of violence monopolization, which means a reduction in decentralized violence. Historically, this has been a significant advancement. The scholar Mankar Olsen once used the term roving bandits to stationary bandits daily to describe this change. What does this mean? Simply put before, there might have been 10 or 20 gangs of bandits taking turns to rob you, but now there's only one left. Although a single gang of bandits is also dangerous, if this gang establishes ownership over this territory, they have some motivation to protect and develop it. After all, if you kill all the chickens, you won't be able to pick up any egg. However, when there were as many as 10 or 20 gangs of bandits, no bandit would have the motivation to develop this territory. Because if I raise chickens, you might be the one to pick up the eggs. If I farm, you might be the one to harvest. If I raise pigs, you might be the one to eat the meat. Then why should I protect this territory? Therefore, the construction of the sovereign state system can be seen as a process of property rights and clarification says territory. And historically, the centralization of violence often also means a large-scale reduction in violence. We previously talked about the area explosion of peace, Daly mentioning that in the past few hundred years, especially after the end of the Cold War, the proportion of war deaths to the population has dropped sharply. However, historically, the most significant reduction in violence occurred during the earlier state revolution. Daily, that is when humanity moved from tribal systems, feudal systems, and empires to the organizational form of sovereign states. This point can be seen on the next page in Figure 3.1. Figure 3.1 shows the proportion of violent conflict deaths, super 100,000 violent deaths right in think non-state societies, sex anti-state society. Well, and it's very striking to see the contrast, almost a cliff-like drop. Previously, we might have imagined the beauty of primitive society as if people in primitive society lived a beautiful life by the mountains and rivers. picking fruits today, singing mountain songs tomorrow, and Rousseau simply called primitive people, what, noble savages, horror. Various studies have shown that primitive people lived in extremely brutal, violent conflicts, constantly facing the danger of life due to the lack of violence monopoly. Today, the rampant gangs in Mexico and Brazil, or the warlord conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, although not as completely anarchic as primitive society, are also manifestations of low state capacity. Some scholars have found through research that a country may fall into a long-term civil war. Not necessarily because the rebels are very powerful, but possibly simply because the government army is too weak to extinguish the spark. This means that in places with low state capacity, rebels may only need 3,000 to 5,000 people, find a base in remote areas, and obtain financial resources through some underground economic channels such as opium, minerals, oil, etc., to drag a country into a long-term civil war, turning a small wound into a large area of infection. In contrast, countries with strong state capacity can often eliminate rebels at the source of their rise, thus avoiding the development of a small spark into a raging fire. In other words, state capacity is a relative rather than an absolute concept. A sick antelope can easily escape from the mouth of a tiger as long as the tiger is even more seriously ill. The second major function of the two-state states is to provide public services. This point should be very easy to understand. The state is a machine of violence, but it is not just a machine of violence, especially in modern society. We have endowed the state with many functions. In ancient times, if the common people were stolen or robbed, or if their family members were beaten or killed, they might go to the government to report the case. But generally speaking, the common people would not go to the government to demand the right to education, sex, because their children could not go to school, nor would they demand the government to provide medical insurance, says because they could not afford to see a doctor. Modern states are a different separation. You go to the government if you can't afford school, can't afford medical treatment, are unemployed. If the road in front of your door is broken, if there is a fire, and even if your neighbor's decoration is too noisy, you might call the mayor's hotline, phone state. So the question arises, we have so many demands on the government, how can it do it? Obviously, only those countries with strong tax collection capabilities can provide good public services. This, of course, does not mean that governments with strong tax collection capabilities will definitely spend the money on public services or can definitely spend the money reasonably, but tax collection capability is one of the necessary conditions for public services. And this point is probably uncontested. We often envy the welfare system of Nordic countries daily, from cradle to grave daily, but its premise is a fiscal and tax capability close to 50% of GDP. Many people in other countries envy China's high-speed rail, China's infrastructure. And this is also behind the government's huge financial and organizational capability. In contrast, those poor and backward developing countries, especially African countries, their financial and organizational capabilities are very low, and as a result, the government is at a loss for many public issues. Take a public health issue as an example. We all know that malaria is a problem that has plagued humanity for many years, especially in Africa. Every year, there are dozens or even millions of people who die of it. However, the prevention and control of this disease is not so difficult in terms of technology. As long as every household hangs mosquito nets containing insecticides, the transmission rate and mortality rate of the disease will be greatly reduced. However, for a long time, many African governments simply could not afford to buy mosquito nets and could only watch countless people in their countries, especially children, die in vain. It is understandable that a country has no money to build aircraft carriers or atomic bombs, but it is a tragedy brought about by low state capacity that mosquito nets cannot be afforded. It was not until recently, with the help of the international community, that the coverage rate of mosquito nets in Africa has significantly increased, and the mortality rate of malaria has also been reduced by more than half. The third aspect that the Deceptus Daily perspective can explain is economic development. A certain degree of market freedom is a prerequisite for economic development, which has increasingly become common sense. However, where does market freedom come from in the past? People simply believed that market freedom was to get rid of the government, to tie up the government's divisible hand daily. And then the market city invisible handry, LCT, start working. As a result, there was an increase in efficiency and economic prosperity, which is the so-called deep expansion of spontaneous order. Gradually, more and more people have realized that it's not that simple. There is no so-called daily expansion of spontaneous order. Daily, the so-called market freedom itself is a political process, just like traffic freedom, to a large extent. It is because the traffic police are maintaining order. To put it simply, the existence and development of the market require property rights protection. So who protects property rights? Although the government has various questionable points, generally speaking, it is more reliable than those gangsters on the street with gold chains around their necks and tattoos on their arms, because its time horizon is usually longer than that of gangsters. Gangsters may be fighting today and may be killed tomorrow, but the government cannot ignore us tomorrow. Therefore, after we buy a house, we have handed over the money and the house, and we still need to get a property certificate. If the market is just the physical expansion of spontaneous order, Teti, we should have ended the transaction after getting the house. However, in fact, only when the housing authority issues us a property certificate, we will feel at ease. Right? Why do we feel at ease? Only when we get this little book issued by the government, because we know that this little book stamped by the government means that all the rights we have to this house, at least legally speaking, have been protected by a machine of violence from then on. And when the government does not have the ability to monopolize violence, this sense of security for property rights no longer exists. In Brazil, many rich people live like prisoners. Why? Because gangs are rampant and the government can't eliminate them. The rich are robbed, kidnapped, and even killed at any time. So the houses of the rich are often equipped with double steel doors, electric grids, security towers, remote monitoring systems, and even drones patrolling back and forth. Tijuana, a city in Mexico we talked about in the last class, is another example. This city, known as the capital of murder in the world, Din was a famous tourist city 20 years ago with a prosperous economy and a large number of tourists. However, due to the rise of gangs, they extorted shops, restaurants, and hotels everywhere, and slowly various shops gradually closed, and a once prosperous tourist city withered into an empty ghost city. This is exactly the situation caused by the lack of state capacity. In addition to property rights protection, some scholars believe that the state can play a greater leading role in economic development. It is not only the police protecting property rights, but also the engine of economic development. We mentioned earlier that the emergence of this East Asian miracles led to the rise of the weak developmental state Shirai. China's rise is seen as another example of this theory. The Korean economist Chang Ha-chun has written a series of books trying to explain that all countries' economic takeoff has experienced state active intervention in the economy. Some Chinese economists, such as Professor Justin Yafusailand, have also proposed the concept of the ineffective government phone to explain China's economic development. Of course, such theories also have many disputes in China's economic development, how much the government has played a role, and to what extent China's economic development is because of government intervention. And despite government intervention, there are also many disputes. You can continue to think about this issue in the future. the historical projection of state capacity. So to sum up, state capacity is very important. It creates order. It is the premise of the modern public service system. It protects property rights to promote economic development. And it may even be the engine of a specific economic development model. Among various studies, what impressed me the most is not the importance of state capacity, but the sustainability of this importance. I have read an article that compared the places in Germany ruled by the Roman Empire and the places not ruled by the Roman Empire. The author found that in the contemporary era, the former is significantly more economically developed than the latter. The author's conclusion is that this economic level difference is very much related to the history of Roman rule. You may wonder, the Roman Empire has been extinct for nearly 1,000 years. How can it affect the contemporary economic level? However, this study says that of course it can affect, because as long as it is a place ruled by the Roman Empire, it will build a developed road system, and the existence of the road system directly affects the commercial development of this place, the density of urban formation, and thus through a snowball effect, it affects. State capacity is not only important, but also its projection is extremely long. There are many studies that follow this line of thought, such as studies on different regions of Vietnam, the Habsburg Empire, and even Africa. The conclusions are roughly the same under other conditions. Places with more mature state construction usually have better governance performance. In these articles, one simply titled, "Zinc the Empire is Dead. Long lit the Empire Dale." So new political trends will bring new political science trends, and Selm, bringing the state back in Guan, has activated the theoretical imagination of political science. For a long time, when we talk about political modernization, the first reaction is often democratic transition. Standing under the historical tradition of Chinese imperial autocracy, this is particularly understandable. However, from the perspective of long-term history, the more significant political revolution may not be theorist democratic revolution, says theorist state revolution. Core, it's just that compared with the democratic revolution, because the political state revolution happened longer ago, we are more likely to forget its value. Now, each of us is born with a nationality, daily Chinese, Lia daily, Americans daily, Lia Japanese daily, Zambians daily, etc. Yeah, so we tend to take theist sovereign state daily for granted. But the fact is that at the same time, obtaining external and internal recognition of stable violence monopoly is an artificial construction. Before that, humanity had been exploring for thousands of years in political organizational forms such as tribes, city-states, empires, feudal systems, noble fiefs, and caliphates, before finally settling in the sovereign state system. Also, because it is an artificial construction, not a natural state. This process is difficult, fragile, and can even be said to be an eternal struggle against the current. For many countries, they are still struggling in this process. Even in China, a country with a long history of state construction, its line state capacity daily also rises and falls. At this point, if you compare the Han Dynasty and the Wei and Jin dynasties, the early Tang Dynasty and the late Tang Dynasty, the early Qiang Dynasty and the late Qiang Dynasty, you will have a clear understanding. We tend to take the things we are most familiar with as the most taken for granted thing. However, in front of the often fragile human nature, any order may be just a mirage.